The fastest way to lose the truth is to believe you already know it. On an ordinary Saturday morning, inside Maggie's country diner in the quiet town of Ashford, every fork stopped halfway. To every plate, the instant a pair of steel handcuffs clicked around the wrists of a calm black man sitting alone in booth 7. Fresh coffee continued to steam from his untouched mug. Sunlight still poured through the front windows, and the smell of bacon and warm biscuits drifted from the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet no one in the diner could remember hearing another sound after that single metallic click. A little girl sitting near the window looked up at her father with confused eyes. "Daddy, did that man do something wrong?" she whispered. Her father opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He simply stared across the room at Police Chief Daniel Brooks, whose expression carried the quiet certainty of a man convinced he was protecting his town. Brooks stood tall in his neatly pressed uniform, one hand resting near his radio, the other holding the completed restraint with practiced confidence. To everyone watching, he looked like a lawman doing exactly what years of experience had taught him to do. Across from him stood the man everyone suddenly wanted to know. He wore a simple navy jacket over a light blue button-down shirt, dark jeans, polished brown shoes, and the calm expression of someone who refused to let another person's assumptions decide his character. He neither protested nor argued. His breathing remained steady. His eyes wandered briefly across the room, meeting the nervous gaze of the waitress before settling quietly on the chief standing in front of him. Emily Carter had worked at Maggie's country diner for nearly 12 years. She had witnessed arguments over football games, family disagreements, political debates, and more than one awkward first date. But she had never seen an entire restaurant become so completely silent. Even the elderly Army veteran sitting near the counter slowly lowered his newspaper, studying the stranger with thoughtful curiosity rather than suspicion. Something about the man's composure did not fit the scene unfolding around him. It was not confidence born from defiance. It was the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth rarely needed to raise its voice. Daniel Brooks interpreted that silence differently. Years of policing had taught him that calm faces sometimes concealed dangerous intentions, and first impressions had become instincts he trusted almost without question. "You will remain right here until we finish sorting this out," the chief said firmly. The man answered with a respectful nod. "I have nowhere else to be at this moment." His voice surprised several people nearby. There was no fear, no sarcasm, no anger, only calm acceptance. Emily looked from the chief to the stranger, feeling an uneasiness she could not explain. Outside, traffic continued moving along Main Street as though the world beyond the diner remained perfectly ordinary. Inside, however, time itself seemed to hesitate. No one knew that the next few minutes would quietly challenge everything they believed about authority, judgment, and the kind of respect that should never depend on a person's appearance. The stranger finally lifted his eyes toward Chief Brooks and spoke one sentence that seemed almost ordinary at first. "Chief, first impressions have a remarkable way of shaping the rest of the day." Daniel answered without hesitation. "Sometimes they also prevent bigger problems." Neither man realized that before breakfast was over, one of those beliefs would never be the same again. 40 minutes earlier, Ashford looked exactly like the kind of small American town people imagined when they talked about peaceful mornings. The sidewalks were clean, the American flag outside the post office moved gently in the cool breeze, and the first rays of sunlight reflected across the storefront windows lining Main Street. A dark gray rental sedan rolled quietly into town after nearly 9 hours on the road. Behind the wheel sat Marcus Ellison, who slowed as he noticed a hand-painted sign advertising homemade breakfast at Maggie's Country Diner. He glanced at the dashboard clock, calculated that he still had plenty of time before his first appointment, and turned into the parking lot. Without drawing the slightest attention, after stepping out of the car, he stretched briefly, adjusted the sleeve of his navy jacket, and silenced an incoming notification on his phone before slipping it back into his pocket. Whatever message had arrived could wait. This morning deserved patience. As soon as Marcus entered the diner, the comforting aroma of fresh coffee, buttered toast, and sizzling bacon welcomed him inside. Emily Carter looked up from the counter and greeted him with the warm smile she offered every customer. "Good morning. Sit anywhere you like." Marcus thanked her politely and chose booth 7 near the front window, where he could watch the quiet town slowly come to life. Emily poured him a cup of coffee before handing him a menu. Passing through, she asked casually. Marcus smiled. Just here for a meeting. Emily nodded without asking another question. Travelers visited Ashford often enough that she had learned not to pry into people's lives. A few minutes later, she returned with pancakes, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and toast. Marcus thanked her by name after reading it on her name tag, earning a surprised smile. Most customers never noticed details that small. Across the room, Frank Morrison, a retired Army veteran who visited the diner nearly every morning, lowered his newspaper and nodded toward Marcus. Long drive, he asked. Marcus smiled politely. Long enough to appreciate a good breakfast. Frank laughed softly. You picked the right place. Their brief conversation ended as naturally as it had begun, leaving the diner wrapped once again in its familiar rhythm. Coffee cups clinked gently against saucers. A local farmer discussed the weather with another customer. A young family shared pancakes, while a little girl colored pictures with a box of crayons. It felt like one of those ordinary mornings that would disappear into memory before lunchtime. Then the front door opened again. Police Chief Daniel Brooks entered wearing his pressed uniform, offering friendly greetings to several regular customers as he walked inside. He stopped briefly at the counter to exchange a few words with Emily before accepting his usual cup of black coffee. As his eyes casually moved across the room, they paused on Marcus. The unfamiliar face immediately caught his attention. Marcus noticed the glance and responded with nothing more than a polite nod before returning to his breakfast. Daniel nodded back almost automatically, but something about the visitor stayed in his mind. Ashford was a town where unfamiliar faces rarely went unnoticed, and years of experience had taught him that paying attention often prevented future problems. Carrying his coffee, Daniel walked slowly toward booth 7. Marcus looked up with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. Neither man realized that a simple conversation over breakfast was only moments away from becoming the first step in a lesson that neither of them would ever forget. Daniel Brooks stopped beside booth 7 and rested one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair across from Marcus Ellison. Mind if I join you for a minute? He asked in a polite but measured tone. Marcus looked up from his breakfast and offered a courteous smile. Not at all, Chief. Daniel pulled out the chair and sat down, placing his coffee on the table before studying the unfamiliar visitor for a brief moment. He had spent more than 2 decades serving Ashford, and experience had taught him that unfamiliar faces often deserved a second look, especially in a town where almost everyone knew one another. I do not believe we have met, Daniel said. Marcus shook his head gently. I do not believe we have either. You are not from around here. No, sir. Business or vacation? Marcus reached for his coffee before answering. Business. Daniel nodded slowly. What kind of business brings you to Ashford? Marcus smiled politely. A meeting. The answer was truthful, but it offered almost nothing else. Daniel noticed the deliberate simplicity of the response. Who are you meeting? Marcus looked out the window for only a second before returning his attention to the chief. Someone expecting me. Daniel leaned back slightly. You seem careful with your answers. Marcus replied without hesitation. I have learned that careful answers usually create fewer misunderstandings. Emily Carter approached carrying the coffee pot, sensing the conversation had become more serious than casual morning small talk. Would either of you like another cup? She asked. Marcus thanked her and accepted a refill. Daniel declined without taking his eyes off the visitor. Emily quietly walked away, but not before noticing that neither man appeared angry. The tension came entirely from uncertainty rather than confrontation. Across the diner, Frank Morrison folded his newspaper just enough to keep both men within sight. Years in the Army had taught him that important moments often began with conversations that sounded perfectly ordinary. Daniel rested his forearms on the table. What line of work are you in? Marcus answered calmly. Public service. Daniel raised one eyebrow. Federal? Marcus smiled faintly. You could describe it that way. The response immediately sharpened Daniel's curiosity. Which agency? Marcus stirred his coffee once before placing the spoon neatly beside the saucer. I would prefer to discuss that during my scheduled meeting. Daniel's expression became more serious. You understand why that sounds unusual. Marcus nodded respectfully. I understand completely. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the diner while the morning traffic continued without interruption. Inside, however, The atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly. Conversations around the room grew quieter as several customers casually observed Booth 7 without pretending otherwise. Marcus remained perfectly composed. He never looked toward the door, never checked his surroundings nervously, and never attempted to end the conversation. Daniel found that confidence unusual. Most travelers questioned by a police chief displayed at least some visible discomfort. Marcus displayed none. Instead, he calmly glanced at the watch on his wrist before looking back at Daniel. The movement lasted only a moment, yet Daniel noticed it immediately. "Waiting for someone?" he asked. Marcus answered honestly, "Yes." Daniel slowly stood from the chair and picked up his coffee. "I believe I have a few more questions before your meeting begins." Marcus offered another respectful nod. "Then I will answer whatever I reasonably can." Neither man realized that the next decision would quietly set into motion an unforgettable chain of events that would challenge everything one of them believed about judgment, authority, and the true meaning of leadership. Daniel Brooks remained standing beside Booth 7 for a long moment, studying Marcus Ellison with the careful attention that years in law enforcement had taught him to trust. The answers had been polite. They had also been unusually guarded. In a larger city, Daniel might have thought little of it, but Ashford was the kind of town where unfamiliar visitors quickly became familiar faces. Marcus calmly picked up his coffee and took another sip without showing the slightest sign of discomfort. "Would you mind showing me some identification?" Daniel finally asked. Marcus looked directly at him and answered without hesitation, "Of course." Slowly and deliberately, he reached inside his jacket, removed a slim leather wallet, and placed it on the table rather than handing it across. The movement was calm enough that no one nearby felt alarmed. Daniel opened the wallet and removed the driver's license. Virginia. The photograph matched perfectly. The name read Marcus Ellison. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Daniel examined it for another moment before looking back up. "How long will you be staying in Ashford?" "Only today." "Where are you headed after your meeting?" Marcus smiled politely. "That depends on how the day unfolds." Daniel frowned slightly. "You seem to answer every question without really answering it." Marcus nodded. "Some conversations are easier once everyone involved has the same information." Daniel closed the wallet but did not return it immediately. Instead, he reached for the portable radio attached to his shoulder. "Dispatch, I need a routine identity verification." He calmly read Marcus's information over the radio while the quiet conversations inside the diner gradually disappeared. Emily Carter stopped wiping the counter. Frank Morrison lowered his newspaper once again. Even the little girl near the window sensed that something unusual was unfolding. Marcus remained exactly where he was, his hands resting peacefully on the edge of the table beside his untouched breakfast. A few moments later, the radio crackled. "Chief, the driver's license is valid. Stand by while additional records load." Daniel acknowledged the message but noticed the unexpected delay. Normally, the system returned complete information within seconds. He waited another moment. The radio spoke again. "Chief, we are receiving a restricted access notification. Some records require higher authorization." Daniel's expression became noticeably more serious. "Repeat that." "The system is limiting access. We are attempting another verification." Daniel slowly lowered the radio. Instead of reducing his concern, the unusual response strengthened it. He looked at Marcus again. "Is there anything you would like to tell me?" Marcus answered in the same calm voice he had maintained from the beginning. "Only that the system is probably working exactly as it was designed." That answer did not reassure Daniel. It convinced him that something significant remained undisclosed. "Mr. Ellison," he said carefully, "until I understand this situation more clearly, I need you to remain here." Marcus inclined his head. "I have no intention of leaving." Daniel appreciated the cooperation, but uncertainty continued to grow. After another brief pause, he made a decision he believed was necessary to maintain control while waiting for additional verification. "For the time being, I am placing you in temporary investigative detention until we receive confirmation from the appropriate authorities." Marcus neither argued nor resisted. He simply stood when asked and quietly complied as Daniel followed department procedure. The soft metallic click echoed across the diner, freezing every conversation in the room. Outside, unnoticed by anyone inside, the first dark government sport utility vehicle slowly turned onto Main Street and headed toward Maggie's Country Diner. The silence inside Maggie's country diner seemed to grow heavier with every passing second after the temporary restraints were secured. No one returned to their breakfast. Coffee slowly cooled inside untouched. Mugs while the scent of fresh pancakes and butter drifted unnoticed through the room. Marcus Ellison remained completely composed, standing exactly where Chief Daniel Brooks had instructed him to remain. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his breathing steady, and his eyes reflected neither resentment nor fear. Daniel watched him carefully. During his career, he had encountered people who argued, people who panicked, and people who attempted to leave before questions were answered. Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he stood with remarkable patience, almost as though he already understood how the morning would unfold. Daniel's radio crackled once again. "Chief, we are still attempting verification. State records are complete, but federal employment information remains restricted. We have been instructed to contact an authorized federal liaison." Daniel pressed the button on his radio. "How long?" A brief pause followed before the dispatcher answered. "We have already placed the request. We are waiting for a return call." Daniel lowered the radio without taking his eyes off Marcus. The response raised more questions than it answered. Restricted records were uncommon, but they were not impossible. Still, something about the situation continued to trouble him. Emily Carter quietly stepped closer, carrying a fresh pot of coffee out of habit before realizing no one seemed interested in another refill. She looked toward Marcus with visible concern. "Sir, are you all right?" Marcus offered her a reassuring smile. "I am fine. Thank you for asking." His calm response eased her concern only slightly. Across the room, Frank Morrison slowly folded his newspaper and placed it beside his plate. After decades of military service, he had developed an instinct for recognizing quiet professionalism, and the man standing near Booth 7 reminded him of officers he had respected throughout his career. Outside the diner, the first dark government sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly into a parking space across the street. Its windows were tinted, and there were no official markings anywhere on the vehicle. Less than 30 seconds later, a second dark vehicle arrived behind it. Neither driver rushed to get out. Instead, both remained seated as though waiting for a precise moment. Inside the diner, Daniel noticed movement through the front window. He glanced outside briefly before returning his attention to Marcus. "Are those vehicles connected to your meeting?" he asked. Marcus looked toward the window for the first time since standing up. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, not into relief, but into quiet recognition. "They may be," he answered honestly. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You expected someone?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." "Who?" Daniel asked. Marcus met his gaze with complete sincerity. "The people who can answer every question you have been asking." Before Daniel could respond, the front door opened softly. A man wearing a dark charcoal suit entered the diner, carrying a slim leather portfolio. He scanned the room only once before his eyes immediately settled on Marcus. Recognition flashed across his face for the briefest moment, followed by disciplined restraint. Instead of calling out, he simply stopped near the entrance and waited. Marcus acknowledged him with the slightest movement of his head, almost too subtle for anyone else to notice. Daniel saw it immediately. Whatever uncertainty had existed only minutes earlier was rapidly giving way to something far larger than an ordinary identity check, and the truth was now only a few moments away from walking through the front door. The man in the charcoal suit remained quietly near the entrance, his leather portfolio held neatly at his side, while his attention never drifted far from Marcus Ellison. He displayed no urgency and made no attempt to interrupt the situation unfolding inside the diner. Instead, he waited with the discipline of someone who understood both timing and protocol. Chief Daniel Brooks noticed the restraint immediately. Most people would have demanded answers after seeing someone standing in temporary investigative detention. This man simply observed. Daniel shifted his attention toward him. "Sir, is there something I can help you with?" The visitor answered with a courteous smile. "I am here for a scheduled meeting." Daniel nodded slowly. "With whom?" The man glanced briefly toward Marcus before returning his eyes to the chief. "The appropriate person." The carefully chosen words sounded professional without revealing anything. Daniel frowned slightly. "You will have to wait until I finish resolving this matter." "Certainly, Chief," the visitor replied without the slightest objection. His willingness to cooperate only deepened the mystery. Emily Carter noticed the exchange while quietly clearing a nearby table that no longer needed clearing. The entire room had become focused on Booth 7, yet every person seemed to instinctively lower their voices instead of raising them. Even the little girl by the window had stopped coloring and now watched the adults with innocent curiosity, sensing that something important was happening without understanding why. Daniel's radio crackled again, interrupting the silence. "Chief, we have an update." He immediately pressed the transmit button. "Go ahead." State support contacted the Federal Records Office. They confirmed that local agencies cannot access the remaining information. "We have been instructed not to continue further database inquiries." Daniel looked surprised. "Did they provide a reason?" "Only that authorized federal personnel are already responding to your location." Daniel slowly lowered the radio. The words echoed in his mind. "Authorized federal personnel are already responding." He looked back toward Marcus. "You knew this would happen." Marcus answered honestly. "I believed it was possible." Daniel folded his arms. "You could have explained everything from the beginning." Marcus met his gaze without the slightest trace of frustration. "Chief, explanations offered before questions are asked often sound like excuses. I believed it was better to answer what you asked truthfully and allow the facts to arrive on their own." Frank Morrison quietly smiled to himself. Those words reminded him of something an old commanding officer had once said many years earlier. Real confidence rarely rushed to defend itself. Outside the diner, another dark government vehicle pulled into the parking lot beside the first two. This time, two professionally dressed men stepped out together, each carrying a slim document case. They walked calmly toward the entrance without speaking, their pace steady and unhurried. The man already waiting near the door acknowledged them with a respectful nod. They returned the gesture without exchanging a single unnecessary word. Daniel followed the movement through the front window. A feeling he could not quite explain began replacing his earlier certainty. His years of experience had taught him to recognize coordinated professionalism when he saw it. Whatever was about to happen had clearly been organized long before this morning began. As the front door opened once again, the two newly arrived officials entered the diner, looked directly toward Marcus, and with unmistakable respect came to an immediate stop, as though they had just arrived in the presence of the very person they had been sent to meet. The three newly arrived officials remained near the entrance for only a brief moment before walking forward with quiet confidence, their attention focused entirely on Marcus Ellison. None of them appeared surprised by the temporary investigative detention. Instead, they carried themselves with the calm professionalism of people who had already anticipated unexpected circumstances. The man with the leather portfolio stepped slightly ahead of the others and stopped several feet from Marcus. Without hesitation, he gave a respectful nod. "Good morning, Director Ellison," he said in a clear, steady voice. "We apologize for arriving a few minutes behind schedule." Every sound inside the diner disappeared. Emily Carter slowly lowered the coffee pot she had been holding. Frank Morrison quietly removed his reading glasses and stared across the room. Even the little girl near the window instinctively looked toward her father, sensing that something important had just happened. Chief Daniel Brooks remained perfectly still. He looked from Marcus to the suited official before repeating the unfamiliar title almost under his breath. "Director?" The official reached inside his jacket and calmly presented a federal credential holder. "Special Agent David Reynolds, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said. "We are assigned to accompany visiting FBI Director Marcus Ellison during today's confidential leadership assessment." Daniel accepted the credential carefully. His eyes moved across the identification twice before returning to the agent. Every detail appeared authentic. Every security feature matched what he had seen during joint federal training years earlier. For the first time since entering the diner, uncertainty replaced confidence. Another official stepped forward carrying the leather portfolio. "Director," she said respectfully, "the assessment team has already assembled at police headquarters. They are waiting for your arrival whenever you are ready." Marcus acknowledged her with a slight inclination of his head, but remained exactly where he stood. His attention shifted instead toward Daniel. Neither triumph nor satisfaction appeared on his face. Only quiet patience. Daniel looked at Marcus with an expression that had completely changed from the one he carried only minutes earlier. "Why did you never identify yourself?" he finally asked. Marcus answered in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning of the morning. Because the purpose of an unannounced leadership assessment is to observe authentic decisions before titles influence behavior. If I had introduced myself first, today's evaluation would never have reflected ordinary reality. Those words settled heavily over the room. Emily suddenly understood why Marcus had answered every question truthfully without revealing more than had been asked. Frank Morrison slowly nodded to himself. The restricted database, the government vehicles, the disciplined officials. Every unusual detail now fit together with quiet precision. Daniel lowered the credential and returned it to Agent Reynolds with careful hands. He glanced briefly toward the temporary restraints before looking back at Marcus. For the first time in many years, he realized that his first impression had become his strongest assumption, and that assumption had shaped every decision that followed. Marcus spoke again, not to criticize, but to teach. Chief Brooks, every community deserves to know that fairness comes before conclusions. Authority is measured not by how quickly we act, but by how carefully we seek the truth before acting. No one inside the diner celebrated the revelation. No one smiled in victory. The only thing that changed more dramatically than the room itself was the quiet understanding that genuine leadership never needed to announce its rank, because character always spoke long before credentials ever did. Marcus Ellison looked at Chief Daniel Brooks for a long, quiet moment before turning slightly toward Agent David Reynolds. "Please remove the temporary restraints," he said in a calm, even voice. There was no bitterness in his words and no desire to prolong an uncomfortable situation. Daniel immediately stepped forward and carefully removed them himself. The soft metallic click echoed across the diner once again, but unlike before, it carried relief instead of uncertainty. Marcus gently adjusted the cuff of his navy jacket, thanked the chief with a respectful nod, and reached for the cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "I appreciate your professionalism now that the facts are clear," he said. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. "Director Ellison, I owe you a sincere apology." The room remained completely silent. Marcus listened without interrupting. Daniel took a slow breath. "I believed I was protecting my community, but I allowed incomplete information and my own assumptions to influence decisions that deserved greater patience. The responsibility for those decisions belongs to me." No one inside the diner looked away. Emily Carter quietly placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter, while Frank Morrison watched with the quiet respect of someone who understood how difficult genuine accountability could be. Marcus finally answered, "An apology has real value when it becomes the beginning of change rather than the end of a conversation." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand." Marcus continued in the same calm voice that had never once changed throughout the morning. "Every leader faces moments when decisions must be made quickly. The challenge is not speed. The challenge is remembering that every person deserves fairness before conclusions. Communities remember how they are treated long after reports are completed." Agent Reynolds quietly observed the exchange before adding a single sentence. "That principle is the reason today's assessment remained confidential." Several customers exchanged thoughtful glances as the purpose of the morning became even clearer. Marcus had never hidden the truth. He had simply refused to let his title become the reason he received respect. Emily stepped forward carrying a fresh breakfast. "Director Ellison," she said with a warm smile, "your pancakes have definitely lost their chance of being delicious. May I bring you a fresh plate?" Marcus smiled for the first time that morning with unmistakable warmth. "I would appreciate that very much, Emily. Thank you." She returned a few minutes later with hot coffee, fresh pancakes, scrambled eggs, and buttered toast. Marcus thanked her by name once again, earning another smile from the waitress. Daniel noticed every small gesture. The title of FBI director had never changed Marcus's manners because those manners had existed long before anyone knew who he was. Frank Morrison quietly rose from his booth, walked past Marcus, and paused just long enough to speak. "Son, I spent 30 years wearing a uniform. The finest leaders I ever met never needed to remind anyone who they were." Marcus stood and shook the veteran's hand respectfully. "Thank you for your service." Frank smiled and returned to his table without another word. Daniel watched the brief exchange carefully. In only a few quiet minutes, he realized that leadership revealed itself far more clearly through ordinary acts of respect than through any badge, rank, or title. Marcus looked toward him once more before finishing his coffee. "Chief Brooks, Our meeting at headquarters should begin on schedule. What we do next will matter far more than what happened here this morning." Daniel straightened his uniform, met Marcus's eyes with renewed humility, and quietly nodded, understanding that the real evaluation was only just beginning. Later that morning, the conference room inside Ashford Police Headquarters was filled with a different kind of silence. Around the large table sat supervisors, command staff, and community representatives who had gathered for the scheduled leadership assessment. Marcus Ellison stood near the front beside Agent David Reynolds and the federal assessment team. A single sentence appeared on the presentation screen behind them. "Respect must come before certainty." Marcus looked around the room before speaking in the same calm voice that had carried him through every moment of the morning. "Every community forms its opinion of law enforcement one interaction at a time," he began. "Most people will never remember the policies you write, but they will always remember how they were treated when they needed fairness the most." No one interrupted. Chief Daniel Brooks listened carefully from his seat near the front of the room. The confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by thoughtful humility. Marcus never mentioned embarrassment, blame, or punishment. Instead, he carefully reviewed the events at Maggie's Country Diner as a case study in leadership under uncertainty. He praised Daniel for maintaining professionalism after the facts became clear, while also explaining how quickly assumptions can influence judgment before every piece of information has been gathered. "Authority is not measured by how much power we possess," Marcus continued. "It is measured by how responsibly we exercise that power when the complete truth has not yet arrived." Daniel slowly stood after Marcus invited him to speak. He looked around the room before taking a steady breath. "This morning reminded me that experience should never replace curiosity," he said honestly. "I believed I was acting in the best interest of my community, but I allowed uncertainty to become confidence before I had earned that confidence through facts. I cannot change what happened, but I can change how I lead tomorrow." Several officers quietly nodded. His words carried weight because they contained no excuses. Marcus acknowledged the statement with quiet respect. "The strongest leaders are not those who never make mistakes," he replied. "They are the ones who choose growth over pride when those mistakes are revealed." By the conclusion of the assessment, several recommendations had been accepted unanimously, including expanded communication training, additional community engagement programs, and new decision-making procedures emphasizing patience during uncertain situations. Daniel personally volunteered to lead the implementation of every recommendation. Weeks later, Maggie's Country Diner looked exactly as it always had. Families gathered for breakfast, travelers stopped for coffee, and the familiar sound of friendly conversations once again filled the room. Emily Carter still smiled whenever someone requested Booth 7, remembering the quiet visitor whose character never changed after his title became known. Frank Morrison occasionally shared the story with curious newcomers, but he rarely mentioned names or positions. Instead, he simply smiled and said that genuine leadership always introduced itself through respect before anyone ever noticed the badge. Marcus Ellison continued traveling from one community to another, conducting leadership assessments with the same quiet humility that had defined him from the beginning. He understood that the most honest evaluation could only happen when people believed they were meeting an ordinary stranger instead of an important official. Long after the government vehicles disappeared from Main Street, the people of Ashford remembered one ordinary breakfast for an extraordinary reason. They learned that a title can command attention, a badge can represent authority, but only fairness earns lasting trust. And when respect comes before judgment, justice no longer depends on who stands before you, because it lives within the choices you make every single day.